Good evening and welcome to our latest Exeter Library in Conversation. And this evening we're absolutely delighted to be joined by authors Nicci Gerard and Sean French, who are also known as the pseudonym Nicci French. Our In Conversations events are free, but if you'd like to give a donation to Libraries Unlimited, which is the charity that runs the 54 libraries in Devon and Torquay, there is a link in the chat. We are also posting to 32 other libraries across Devon and Tor Bay this evening. So hello to everybody else who's watching. And if you'd like to ask a question, pop in the chat and I will ask Nicci and Sean. So Nicci and Sean are married and they live in London, and they have written 23 novels by Nicci French, including the best-selling Frida Klein series, published in 31 different languages, which is very impressive. And this is really impressive. So they have sold in excess of 15 million copies of their books. And this evening, they're here to chat about their latest book, which is called The Unheard. And I have the proof here, and it is just out last week on the 16th, I believe.
That's right.
So good evening to you both.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
Be here.
And greetings to everyone.
Next time, can we come in person, please?
Absolutely, yes, we'd love to welcome you to Exeter. So would you like to tell us a bit about The Unheard and the story behind it?
Yeah, should I say? Well, in a way, our different books, different ideas come in different ways, and sometimes it's just very simple. And The Unheard really was an example of a very simple one. In a way, I should say that Nicci and I, the way we think of ideas is we're just talking about it all the time. Different, could this be a story? Could this be a story? And it's a matter of finding something that really grabs both of us, that won't let us go. And for this one, it was really, in a way, a very simple idea. We just thought about the idea of a single mother and her little 3-year-old girl comes back home with a drawing she's done, and the drawing seems to show that she's witnessed a murder. And of course, the thing about a 3-year-old, as we've known, because we've had various 3-year-olds earlier years ago, is they're lovely and sweet, but you can't talk to them in a normal way. They can't give you a reliable, they're not reliable witnesses, and they certainly can't be witnesses in a trial. So this woman, this mother, sees what seems to have been a murder, and what does she do then? Partly there doesn't seem to be a murder that's happened, so what she then has this strange problem about an apparent account, picture of a murder, and then what happens then? And that idea wouldn't let us go, and that's really the germ of The Unheard.
Thrillers are full of unreliable witnesses, but we love a child is the most unreliable of all unreliable witnesses, and we wanted to have a little girl who's continually trying to tell her mother what she's seen, but she doesn't have the language for it. And so Tess, the mother, has to continually try and decode her and work it out, and she gets it wrong quite a lot. And all the time you think there is danger somewhere. There is danger somewhere very close at hand, but where is it and what is it?
It's the story. I was instantly hooked by it. As you're right in there, aren't you? With it's not long before you're into the story, and she finds the picture, and you're like, whoa, what? This is dark. It's dark. And I don't want to give any spoilers away, but the book sort of looks at a lot of relationships, doesn't it? In the book, and there's lots of red herrings as you go through, and Tess, like you said, she can't just ask Poppy what has happened, but things happen, and she sort of goes down lots of different paths, doesn't she? Did Tess was she inspired by anybody, or was she just sort of
I would say that Tess wasn't inspired by one particular person. What she was definitely inspired by was our feelings about being a parent, having had young children, and now actually 2 of our daughters are primary school teachers, and they work with very little children. They tell us lots of stories about the kind of strange things that children say, the kind of category errors that children make, and the way their imaginations work so differently. And so actually Tess kind of came out of the feeling of how kind of scary it is to be a parent, and how little we understand children and what's going on in their heads. And it was that kind of casting back to when we had little children and then trying to wind that into a really credible thriller. And then actually, as with the most of our novels, we have an idea, and then bit by bit, Tess's character, we had to kind of find a character who would go with that idea. We wanted her to be a single mother, kind of recently gone through this breakup with her partner, Poppy's father, and she's anxious. She, like so many parents, she's a very anxious parent, and half of the time she's thinking, is this me just being an over anxious parent, and should I just get a grip on myself, or has something really happened? So there's continually that dynamic between her, you know, of her self-questioning.
Also, the kind of thrillers that we write, that we're interested in, it's not so much kind of, can we catch a terrorist or something like that, but more about the fears that are in all of our lives, which is just, you know, who do you really, how well do you know your friends and your neighbors? You know, who do you really trust? You know, and how, and then when you think, if you know, almost everyone, you can do it for yourself, when you think of who the people you trust, and but how have they earned that trust? You know, so we want to kind of play on that, the kind of insecurity that maybe we all feel. Certainly we feel it.
And once you start thinking like that, the world becomes just a terrifyingly unsafe place.
Definitely.
Everywhere you look, the world is unsafe. And if you've got little kids, then that's the most terrifying feeling of all, that the world is unsafe for her.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? And she does really go to, you know, because she really, you know, she trusts her daughter, but as you say, you know, she's 3, and you know, and she says things, doesn't she? There's a few sort of hints early on that she thought that she did see something, but I'm not going to give that away. But she quite quickly sort of seeks help, doesn't she, to try and sort of find out whether Poppy did really see it or she didn't. But she becomes more and more desperate, doesn't she, as the story progresses, because like you say, she has that fear, and you know, she needs to know whether it's true or whether it's false.
Yeah. And when you say she trusts her daughter, well, I mean, she doesn't really trust her daughter. She doesn't trust her daughter. She doesn't trust herself to know what her daughter is saying. One of our children used to say a lot, when I used to be a cat. And when he say that, he really did think that he used to be a cat. And that's just one tiny little sentence amongst all the kind of words that children use, that just shows you that children just don't see the world in the same way that we see it, and the kind of the boundaries between the imagination and reality, they're very porous and barely exist in some cases. So we wanted to capture just that strangeness of a child's imagination.
But she I mean, I was, as I said, I was completely hooked on it, and I galloped through it, which I really love in a thriller. And you've been writing thrillers for many years, haven't you? So
many years.
many years. And when you started writing them many years ago, you weren't sort of you know, alone in writing them, but have you noticed that the sort of huge increase that there has been in the last sort of few years, particularly around sort of domestic noir and psychological thrillers, and more and more people sort of writing about this type, you know, about relationships and people, rather than, you know, big country houses and crimes and things like that?
Yeah, maybe a move away from police procedural one as well. I think,
yeah,
that's right. I think for a start, that when we wrote our first book, which was published way back in 1997, we, you know, you write the books you have to write, and what we were interested in, the kind of first ideas we had were about people like us and about the kind of everyday fears. So that, but I think just maybe what you always find, it's a bit like, you know, when you, if we go back to children, you know, you give when you have a new child and you give your child what seems like an extremely unusual name.
Yeah.
And it turns out that everyone's you know, they suddenly go to school and there are 5 other children called that name. And I think there was just, people, we all in the culture just got more interested in in certain kinds of psychology. And we saw people, you know, that perhaps there's been a rise of therapy. People have been more open about mental illness. I mean, you can look at it in all different ways. So I think maybe that was part of it. And thrillers have always been a good way for a society to look at what are we all at the moment? What are the things that worry us? What are the sore spots we're jabbing at? And I think that maybe there's, as a culture, we become more aware of psychological vulnerability.
I think that's right. And then also, not just what are the things that we are most fearful about. I mean, one of the kind of appeals of thrillers is that they give a shape to the kind of mess of fear that most of us have at one point or another. So they kind of give us a narrative, like a stepping stones across it. And I think that's partly why they become increasingly popular. When you say, have we noticed the rise in psychology? We have certainly noticed the rise in, I mean, there are, you know, I don't even think that we thought that we didn't know that we were writing psychological thrillers when we first started off. We were just writing the kind of thriller that we felt compelled to write. But now psychological thriller is its own very flourishing, wonderful genre. And there are even genres within that. You talk, you know, the domestic noir, that these kind of lovely little kind of tags that it's being given just shows how popular it's become. And we feel that the psychological thriller is just, you can do anything within it. I mean, there is a contract you have with yourself and your reader that there's going to be a kind of mystery and some kind of solution. And then within that, you can do anything you want. You can be as bleak as you want, as dark as you want, as extreme or weird as you want. And it will hold, it's a kind of this baggy but beautiful structure that can hold anything.
Do you have any favourite authors that write the sort of, you know, do you like the Scandi sort of thrillers, or do you read sort of dark things, or do you steer away from other people's?
No, not at all. I mean, for a start, I should say that my mother's Swedish. I'm half Swedish, and we spend every summer when COVID isn't happening in Sweden. So we're very, for a start, yes. So for me, definitely the Scandinavian thrillers and that whole side, which of course comes out of a certain, you could say, a kind of northern angst, a certain way of looking at the world.
Where we go every summer, except this summer, of course, in Sweden, is exactly where Will Dean,
really, yeah,
sets his extremely gothic and strange.
Yeah.
I mean, there's somebody to mention. I mean, he writes very different kind of thrillers to us, but nevertheless, they're an example of the kind of wild, different directions that a thriller can take. But we read, I mean, it feels almost invidious to select thrillers that we love, although people like Erin Kelly or Sophie Hannah or Val McDermott, you know, we read a lot of thrillers, but then we read a lot of other books as well. We kind of, you know, and it's not thrillers that we particularly find our inspiration from, because actually, if you read a thriller, you can't get into it. They've done that.
Yeah.
You have to go somewhere else to find what it is that you want to do.
Definitely. So you've been writing together for lots of years, and I'm fascinated, and I'm sure everybody else is that I imagine that you now, after many years, have a system of doing that, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, you say after many years we have a system. In fact, system is a kind way for the way that we write, and a system, but the way we write now is pretty much the way we've always written together from the very first book, The Memory Game, that we wrote together, because it's the only way that we know how to do it, really, which is that we don't actually sit in a room and write together. So we will spend weeks and months thinking, kind of coming up with the idea that, as Sean said earlier, has to grab both of us, at the sense that this is something we want to live with for a year. This is a subject that won't let us go. And then we spend a long time working out the story, the characters, the kind of journey of the novel, the voice, of the novel. And then when we're both sure that we've got the same idea in both of our heads, then we set off to write it. And Sean and I we write as far away from each other as we can possibly get in our house. And one of us say Sean writes the first section or chapter, and then he'll email it to me. The emailing it is very important, and I am perfectly free to edit it, add to it, change it, erase it and rewrite it, and then I will write the next section or chapter and send it back to Sean. So we proceed like that, passing it between us. But the important thing is that it's not that Sean is writing as Sean French and I'm writing as Nicci Gerard and we're mashing this thing together. It really is that we're writing into the voice that we've created of Nicci French. And we're a different writer when we write as Nicci French. So it's not a power struggle between voices. It's the voice of Nicci French, which we're continually trying to access.
Yeah, so if you say how have things changed, I mean, I'm not sure they've changed that much, but when we set out to write our first book, The Memory Game, that was because we were both, at that time, both journalists, you know, we just thought of doing, because we were married and, you know, both writing, we just talked about maybe writing together. So the first book, The Memory Game, we really did embark on that as an experiment. Just could we do it? And I think the thing that took us by surprise is it wasn't, as I think as Nicci said before, it wasn't, you know, actually once we did collaborate, once we started writing, although originally it wasn't as Nicci French. That was just a later decision after we'd finished our first book. But we did find that you were free in some ways to write in a different way, and that was really unexpected. I think that's one of the reasons. One of the reasons we've carried on all these years. There's just this constant excitement about becoming a different writer, really, when you collaborate.
And I think people, you know, I'm still sort of surprised after working in libraries for sort of 16 years that I'll say to people, because I knew quite early that you were two people, but I'll say, or what I said the other day, I'm going to be interviewing Nicci French. You know, they're not one person, and they're like, really?
We like that. Yeah. We really like that. I mean, the reason that we decided to have one name on the cover rather than two is because we think there's one voice in that, and you don't want a reader kind of picking up a book and trying to work out where the joins are. You want them to kind of surrender themselves to that voice. That's one of the joys of reading fiction, is you let yourself go into this created world, and we needed to have that. So when people think that we're one person, that's a kind of compliment to us. And you know, Nicci French is in some ways, she is one person.
And there aren't actual joins. By the time anyone else sees it, we've both gone over it so much. Yeah. So it's like, you know, it's kind of like we've cooked a stew together. You can't really pick out a carrot, carrot, you know.
I really like that. I really like how thinking about it. I mean, have you do you think it's brought you closer together? I mean, you're still sat there, so I mean, it's definitely done something.
I mean, normally, when someone asks something like that, I will say something ironic and sarcastic, but I think it really has, in the sense that, you know, I mean, maybe lots of relationships act genuinely in a good way depend on being separate, but there's something about how we've just been working together, solving problems together, having ideas together. So we are kind of, for you know, as it says, for better or for worse. We're just always roped together. You know?
Not always. But no, I would say that it is one of the most intimate things, writing together and rewriting each other and seeing the way each other's imaginations work. There's some, and also that it is an act. It's a continual act of trust. So there is something very exposing and vulnerable about writing something, and it feels very kind of close to you and part of you, and you hand it over to somebody else and they are free to tamper with it in whatever way they think best. And you have to be so full of faith that it's not a kind of power trip, that they're not going to kind of laugh at you or or make you feel foolish, and you have to dare to do things that might seem foolish and give it to the other person. And so that is it's a very vulnerable thing. And we've been doing it for, well, you know, what's the maths, 26 years or whatever it is. And that's extraordinary. And it's been like, it really has been like having an adventure together, exploring the world together, thinking through our writing through all the things that make us fearful or anxious or doubtful or angry, and going through them in our writing together. So I mean, you know, there have been times where it's infuriating and you kind of feel oppressed. And of course, if you spend all that time with someone, but that is so outweighed by the kind of richness of this experiment.
It's probably been a bit like our couples therapy that we've conducted, you know, in public. Yeah. sending it out into the world.
Yeah, because I mean, there is a way, if you read through all the books that we've written, and as you say, we have written rather a lot of books together now, it's like a kind of hidden biography of our relationship, I think, of the things that really trouble us and the things we're having to kind of tussle with and come to terms with.
That's really fascinating, and I think it, you know, it really does sort of, you know, just the fact that you're going, you know, 26 years later is amazing, and that you're still keeping coming up with new things, and that your books are still so gripping. Have you ever really disagreed about something? Have you ever sort of?
Well, I mean, I think some people think that we're, you know, because we managed to do this and carry on writing books together, we must be incredibly mature people who never argue, and we have just the same old awful squabbles that everyone else has. So, but we've never had, we've really never had big arguments about, well, we're writing, because that's just like I mean, it's almost like fixing a machine. Actually, that's a terrible bad idea about fixing things, because I remember some of our worst arguments, like everyone else is trying to like assemble a piece of IKEA furniture, and so we become,
which neither of us are very good at. So
we've been very immature while doing that. No, but I think I feel that we just, in that, when we work together, we are, you know, it's not, I mean, there should be it should be like a rule of being respectful, but I think we just are. We constantly disagree. Also, we're very clear that if one person suggests an idea, the other person has a complete veto on it if they, you know, they don't like it. And I think we're, you know,
yeah, and so it is almost like this unwritten contract that we have, is that we do not kind of have a tantrum if our words are changed. We do not kind of try and force what we want onto the other and try and persuade them. There are certain things, and I think that has worked, because that is the only way that we can continue writing together. If we behaved badly every time we felt badly, I mean, it would just have fallen apart before we even got the first book finished.
So because you both write individually as well, you have your own books in your own right, does it feel strange when you write individually now? Is it sort of, or is it sort of quite cathartic and a bit like, I can do this and this is mine, and it's your voice, and so Sean's voice and Nicci your voice, rather than Nicci French's voice?
I think that's such a good question. I mean, speaking for myself, I would say that it has always felt very necessary that we are two separate people, as well as being kind of joined at the hip as Nicci French. And that's very important, both for our writing and for our relationship, is that we can kind of separate from each other and have us. And what that really feels like is just hugely lucky that we can be three different writers, and we can access these different voices, and that just feels tremendous. I think the thing that's the real I mean, because actually when we're writing as Nicci French, the actual act of writing still involves that kind of letting go of oneself into the kind of mysterious kind of world of kind of producing words. So that feels to me quite similar. What's very different is all the bits around it, like thinking up ideas, kind of brainstorming, doing interviews, meeting readers, all of that which we do together, and that's really lovely. You know, we've had such extremely nice times kind of going around the country and going around the world, actually, just kind of being together and doing it together, and that's very unlonely.
That's nice, isn't it, that you've been able to sort of share that experience as Nicci French together, because I guess, you know, if you were both writing individually, you'd both be going off in your, well, I mean, you know, I imagine you do, you know, when you know, if you have your own sort of book tour for your own individual work, you would go off and do that separately, and the other one might come along with you, but you're not part of it, I guess. You're sort of
also, if you were interviewing me just on my own and I suddenly ground to a halt, there would just be a silence. Whereas I think I can make it. Nicci can then start talking and it sounds rehearsed.
She knows exactly where to come in, and
no, I'm just always interrupting him anyway.
So you, as we've said, you've written pretty much every year, haven't you, for the since '97, and you wrote the series of the Frida Klein books, and you've written your standalones, and the Unheard is one of those. Do you have a preference for either the series or the standalone, or is it sort of, you know, the same?
I wouldn't say there's a preference. I mean, we'd always thought for years that, you know, because we did something like 12, 13 books before Frida Klein, and we'd always thought that's what we did. But we just came across an idea, and it was really the character of Frida Klein, who was clearly not going to be just one book. She was too kind of mysterious a character, and she wouldn't give, you know, we wanted to kind of explore her from different angles and put her under different pressures. And so as soon as we talked about her, it was really clear. And so it did feel like having a whole new career, because writing a series, there's such a different feel, and it really changes your relationship to your readers, because they know that they know the characters of your next book in a way, and you actually meet people who have opinions about your characters while you're still thinking about them, whereas normally with a standalone, by the time everyone else comments on these people, they're done, their story's over. So it was very interesting, and it was, we made a real decision that with the Frida and the group of people around her, that we'd follow them over in real time, you know. So we wanted to see them over, you know. So I mean, there were 8 books in the series, and it covered about 8 or 9 years, I think maybe 10 years. And we wanted to show the effect of how they get older and they change and they develop. And that was. But on the other hand, there was something really, having done that, it felt like another holiday when we came back and wrote suddenly starting new with every book, and a new world, new characters. So they both have really, I think readers have, but when we're divided, I think readers, it'd be very interesting hearing how readers have reacted. You know, some who people like the kind of the Frida Klein thing where you know the characters, and some liking the separate thing. It's strange.
So the reason that, I mean, it's very hard for psychological thrillers to be serious. You have to find a reason why
it would carry on.
Why someone like Frida, who's not a detective, can keep going, kind of book after book, acting as some kind of detective. And we think we found, you know, with Frida, who was a therapist, so she was like a detective of the mind, and she was pulled into this story. We think we found a way of doing that. But
for 8 books.
We couldn't have continued it forever, because that would have been ridiculous. But so if we were to ever write another series, it would have to be because we had an idea like that.
I mean, it's quite a commitment, isn't it? 8 books is, you know, to sort of have enough information to sort of to develop those characters and bring them back and bring more people on with them. It's a much bigger commitment than, you know, having that idea. And
we're never going to do that again. I mean, by which I mean we're never going to do what we did, which was, looking back, was insane, where we actually announced in advance we were writing an 8-book series. And if we'd either run out of ideas after 2 or 3 books, or people hadn't liked them, it would have been very embarrassing to stop on like Wednesday.
Yeah, but they were all named after days of the week, so it was very clear that there were 2 other days of the week and then one day.
Yeah. the first book that I read of yours was Catch Me When I Fall, and that one I remember I listened to it in the car when I was driving to work and back, and I remember just being completely sort of blindsided by the story of this woman who thinks that things are happening to her, and in her mind they very much are happening to her. I don't want to give it away for anybody else, but I absolutely, like, I mean, it really sort of freaked me out as well, because it was, I think you said earlier on, Sean, about how you tap into people's fears, and it was terrifying because actually it could happen. It could, you know, and as you go through the book, you find out the other side, and you know, it's not as it may appear. But that sort of suspense and the tension that I remember in that narration is so hard to explain. How do you get that onto paper? Does it come from you, because sort of your sort of fears, or do you have to sort of change it to be like that?
No, well, I'm actually losing my voice, but anyway, it absolutely comes from our fears. We've never thought this is the kind of thing that will frighten someone else. You know, this is a mechanism for being frightening. We always start from what are the things that really worry us? What are the kind of things that might, you know, that thing you know, and I think we feel this very strongly. If you just take our anxieties, things in our life that we've sort of either come across or thought about, and if you just push the dial a few notches, and that's, you know, I think it has to come. And I think always the stories that I feel work best are the more personal they are, the better.
And kind of life is very scary, and it's, you know, the mind is a very scary place, and we both feel that people who think that they're in control of their life, they're deluding themselves, really, because tiny things can make a whole life shatter. And we're interested in that moment where a life kind of turns on itself, and then what happens? Then, you know, as it unravels, what happens to the person?
It is that unraveling that I think we all find fascinating, and I think why that sort of genre is so popular, because I think we all know that, you know, we all experience things in our lives that are difficult, and it's like you said, sort of turning the notch up on that couple bits, you know, that it could go really badly wrong. And it's not, I think it's sort of being able to sort of dip your toe into that sort of really dark side, isn't it? And
well, one of our mantras has always been that I think sometimes in thrillers, I don't want to be critical, you know, but you know, in some thrillers, you almost feel that everyone knows they're in a thriller right from the beginning. And I think we often have a feeling that our characters, right at the beginning of the book, they think they're in another kind of book. You know, they think they're in a rom-com or just a normal novel, and they suddenly, you know, in a way, we all have an idea of the story we're in, of our life, and they suddenly, and we've almost consciously in several of our books have started as if they're romantic books. You know, this is a happy thing and it's just, oh, you know, and anyone can do this almost as an exercise. Most rom-coms are actually very close to psychological thrillers. It's just if they're always full of people doing mad gestures, like coming to your office with flowers or singing to you in public in a restaurant. If that's the person you're going to fall in love with, maybe that's charming. But if it's someone you don't want to do that, it's absolutely terrifying, especially if they keep doing it, you know. And so I think that, you know, so in a way that's, you know, I think that it is the idea of, or where people may have experienced that moment where, you know, this is just in real life, when something terrible happens, and like when you have an accident or suddenly a terrible illness or something, when there's a transition from just everything's going along normally, and then you realize everything has changed, and it's very hard to make that adjustment and realize, look, your life isn't what you, I mean, what that's very much the case with Tess in the Unheard, is she really feels I mean, in a way, there's a terrible thing we do in our books is we create characters we rather love, and then we give them as hard a time as possible. And Tess, she's almost like what's hubris, you know, she thinks at the beginning, in a way, she thinks, I've done this really well. Everything is fine in my life now. It's all so we're kind of really setting her up to discover that she's just her life is not what she thought it
Yeah,
was.
as soon as somebody in a thriller thinks they're okay, that's a bad sign.
Yeah. Yes, that's a warning to everybody who's reading one of your books, is that if you think they're going to be fine, then they're really not. Have you ever found with an idea, or that it was too difficult to write? So have you
You mean psychologically?
No, that's writing together.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'd say about that is that twice we've begun a book and got halfway through and then abandoned it, and once we wrote a whole book and then abandoned it at the end, partly because we had an idea that we thought was just better. So certainly there have been times writing together when things just haven't worked, that there have been problems that just were like kind of obstacles that we couldn't get past, and that it just didn't come alive as we went through it. It would kind of died on us. I think that's slightly different. Maybe you're saying, are there subjects that are too painful that we can't confront? And that's really interesting. There was, as an example, there was a time, I think during an interview, or maybe just to each other, we thought the one thing that we would never be able to write about, and this was when our children were little, was a child dying. Because the stakes are so high when a child dies, and we just thought we couldn't go there. It would be too kind of, we couldn't expose ourselves to that. And then as soon as we'd said that out loud, as the words were said, then we thought, well, clearly that's what we've got to do. We've got to write about a child dying. So we wrote a kind of long short story about it, and that was kind of interesting. I think there's no subject that should be untouchable. It's just that some subjects are kind of incendiary, and you have to treat them with care, I think.
And that's very much true. I mean, we often have, there's certain scenes in our books and certain themes where there's nothing we won't take on, but there's some you have to be really be so careful. And also want to say, I mean, in a way it arises a bit with this book. There's some books that you're almost pressing a button. It's almost too easy, So to put it, we put a lot of thought into this book. You can actually you can get each rather cheap thrills by putting a child in peril, and you've got to be very careful the way that you do that. So you're not just, because I think if the readers, we feel it as writers, but if the reader feels you're just pulling cords or like attaching electrodes to them in a kind of mechanistic, mechanistic way, then you're gonna just lose the readers.
And there's a couple of times we've talked about sexual abuse, kind of actual rape, or the aftermath of sexual abuse, and you just have to tread very carefully with subjects like that, which are so terrifyingly raw.
On the other hand,
you just have to do it, but you just have to do it well. Or there was another time when we one of our books, which is called Land of the Living, it starts with the central character, the narrator, waking up in the dark and her hands are bound, and she's kind of got a mask over it, and it's just, she has no idea how she got there, and she doesn't even remember who she is to begin with. It's like begins with this horrifying blank, and then bit by bit she tries to kind of piece together who she is and what's happened. And we had planned that, lying in the dark, fitting things together in her head, to go on for something like 100 pages. It was going to be this great big slab at the beginning of the book, and after about 30 pages we just thought, we cannot let her stay here any longer. We have, this is enough, otherwise it becomes like a kind of torture porn or something. And thrillers, the risk of thrillers is that lots of women are treated very badly in thrillers, and you have to be cautious about what you're doing with that they should never just become kind of clues and objects, that you always have to think of them as kind of subjects and lives that matter.
I think that's something that's changed, hasn't it, as well, as for lots of years it was very sort of common for women. It still is to a certain extent, but I know I remember Erin Kelly talking very much about that in one of her things about how trying to bring women to sort of fight back and not just be the victim in the books.
And not just to be the body on the floor that's the clue, that's the clue mystery that's got to be solved by this male detective.
Yeah, so we've had lots of those, haven't we? So we're really nearly at the end now, and I'd just like to end on asking you, I know we touched on it earlier on about what you like to read in regards to sort of thrillers, but what do you both like to read in addition to thrillers? Because I'm sure there are, looking at your bookshelves behind you, I'm convinced they're not all thrillers.
We're both I think one of the big, if you ask all writers, they just, you have to, it's one of the main advice you give to everyone. If you want to write, you've just got to read and read and read and read. And I think you mustn't just read in one area. So I think we read just all sorts of things. I think Nicci I read more, probably a bit more non-fiction.
You read much non-fiction
than Nicci does, but
there's a gender gap between us, because one of the things that Sean does, which I think lots of men do this, and don't want to be stereotyping anyone, but Sean reads. He reads so many books all at the same time. He hasn't just got a bedside table with books he's reading. He's got a whole shelf of books he's reading, and like there are just dozens and dozens of them. So he'll pick up and read 5 pages of that and put it down. And I absolutely, I'm a one book at a time person, and I do read more fiction and Sean, although but also both of us, we read kind of fiction, classic fiction, we read contemporary fiction from all over the world. Sean reads lots of non-fiction and I read some. We read poetry, we read histories, just everything.
And that's been really important to us, is our ideas come from the weirdest. We're as likely, anyway, you could say obviously to you get ideas from reading books of psychology, which we have, but we've had ideas from, you read someone's memoirs or just something completely, and they'll just be, all you need is a little moment in a book, might be, and the important thing in a way, and again another thing we've discovered, is you can't go looking for it. It's a bit like falling in love. You kind of fall in love, but often when you're not expecting it. And I think it's the idea, it's quite good just to read almost randomly, just everything, and you should be interested in everything, and then you'll find it'll feed in ways you just don't expect. We've
quite a lot of times gone to prisons, kind of women's prisons and men's prisons, to do reading groups, and there's something just so moving about people who are kind of locked up, often for many years, who are wanting to are reading books and wanting to talk about them, because reading makes you free. It kind of, the walls come down with reading, don't they?
Yeah.
You can be in any life at any time, and your kind of boundaries all dissolve. I think reading is such a kind of salvation for many people, including us.
I think I'm with you, Sean. I'm a bit like, I have lots of books on the go, and my husband's like you, Nicci. He's like,
so you're disproving me.
Well, we're the complete opposite, because he's a one book man, and I have like a toppling TBR pile by the bed that I've started like 10 pages and then gone on to another one. I think that's I think that I know quite a few people who have sort of 3 or 4 books on the go at once, but generally quite often people will have like one fiction, one non-fiction, maybe a short stories, whereas I can't read the same genre, so I can't have like 2 crime books on the go at once, because I get muddled. So
that would be very confusing.
It would be very confusing. Oh, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to
thank you,
and look forward to see what's coming next for next year. I imagine you've got something planned.
Yes.
So if you'd like to read any of the books that we've discussed this evening, you can order them from Devon or Torbay libraries, or from our friends at the Bookery. And our next In Conversation is next Tuesday on the 28th September at 7 p.m, and that's with the acclaimed, I'm going to say this because I've been practicing it all day, memoirist Kathy Retzenbrink, and she's going to be talking about her fiction debut, Everyone is Still Alive. And the Details of all our events are on our Exeter Library Facebook Live. Thank you again, Sean and Nicci, for joining us this evening. It's been absolutely fascinating, and good evening to everybody.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.